Here, buy yourself a real life." The folded bills fluttered down onto the wet pavement, and the young man in the grease-stained shirt slowly bent to pick them up. Around him, women in bright, expensive dresses laughed and pointed. At the battered yellow cab, at his worn shoes, at the crumpled cash in his palm. He said nothing. He just kept gathering the money they had thrown at his feet like he was nothing. Then, a long black car eased to the curb. A man in a tailored suit stepped out, froze, and said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Mr. Whitmore? Sir, is that you?" The laughter died in the women's throats. The cab driver looked up from his knees. Caught. 3 weeks earlier, Julian Whitmore had everything the city of Atlanta could sell. His name was carved into the glass of 2 downtown towers. His cars were the kind that made strangers slow down and stare. When he walked into a room, conversation softened, backs straightened, and people who had never met him decided, on the spot, that they loved him. And every single day, Julian felt more alone than the day before. That evening, he sat by himself in a living room the size of most people's homes. The lights of the city burned below him. His phone glowed in his hand, and the messages on the screen told him everything he already knew. One woman wanted a new car, because the one he had bought her last month suddenly embarrassed her. Another needed him to cover her sister's tuition, her rent, and a vacation, all in the same breath. A third simply wrote, "Baby, I saw a bag today. Only $9,000. You have it. Don't be stingy with me." He read them the way a man reads a bill he is tired of paying. It had not always felt like this. When Julian was younger, he believed that love was something you proved with your hands open. He gave, and told himself the giving was the love. But over the years, the pattern had become impossible to ignore. The woman who cried in his arms about her suffering family turned out to have spent his money on gold. The woman who said she loved him after 2 dinners and asked him on the 3rd to move her cousin abroad. They did not love him. They loved the shape his money made in their lives. And when he finally understood that, something in his chest went quiet and cold. He stood and walked to the window. The security lights lit his cars like museum pieces. Everything he could see, he owned. And still, one question turned in him like a key that would not open anything. If I had nothing, he thought, would a single one of them stay? Would anybody look at me and see a man instead of a bank? He did not sleep that night. He walked the length of his house until the sky went gray, and by morning he had decided to do something no one in his family would ever forgive. He would disappear into the life of an ordinary man. He would take off the watch, the name, the respect that was never really his, and he would find out what the world did to a person it believed had nothing. Not a small experiment, a real one. He would become a cab driver. 2 days later, Julian stood in a dusty repair lot on the south side of the city, wearing a plain shirt, faded jeans, and shoes he had bought from a corner store. In front of him sat an old yellow cab. The paint had gone dull and chalky. One seat was split along the seam. When he pressed the horn, it gave a tired, apologetic sound. The man selling it squinted at him. "This one will give you trouble, my friend." "You sure?" Julian ran his hand along the cracked dashboard and, for reasons he could not explain, felt more honest than he had in years. "This is the one I want," he said. He told his family he was traveling. His father barely looked up from his papers. Only his mother, Diane, paused at the door and studied him a moment too long. The way mothers do when they sense a child is about to do something that will change him. "Whatever you're chasing," she said quietly, "be careful it doesn't catch you instead." He kissed her cheek and left, and he did not understand then how right she was. That night, in a small rented room across town, he looked at himself in a spotted mirror. The man staring back did not look like Julian Whitmore, heir to an empire. He looked like someone the world would rush past without seeing, someone who would have to fight for every dollar and every scrap of respect. He set his real watch, worth more than most cars, in a drawer, and closed it. From today, he told the reflection, you are just Jay. He almost smiled. He had no idea that the man in the mirror was telling the truth in ways he could not yet begin to imagine. The first morning behind the wheel taught him more than a lifetime of boardrooms. He had thought the work would be simple. Pick people up, drop them off, collect the fare, move on. He drove out before the sun was fully up, into a city that was already awake and already impatient. Vendors were shouting prices. Students crowded the corners. Women balanced bags and babies and stepped into the road without looking. And every one of them expected the cab to already know where they were going. By noon, his shirt was soaked through. Fuel cost more than he had ever bothered to notice in his life. The roads punished the old cab, jarring his spine at every crater, and the horn he pressed to warn a swerving truck answered with that same weak, embarrassing wheeze. Then a man in a reflective vest stepped in front of him at a junction and demanded a fee. Julian frowned. I paid this morning. The man smiled without any warmth at all. That was the morning fee. This is the afternoon one. You must be new. Behind him, other drivers were already leaning on their horns, shouting at him to move, to stop blocking the road. And Julian realized there was no argument to win here, only money to lose. He paid and drove on, and understood that 1,000 small hands were waiting all day to take a piece of whatever a poor man managed to earn. Passengers climbed in already angry at the day, and decided he was the reason for it. One man refused to pay full fare and called him useless when he had no change, snapping his fingers as though Julian were a dog that had failed a trick. A woman told her friend, right there in the back seat, loud enough for him to hear, he's fine to look at, but God forbid I ever bring home a cab driver. They laughed and climbed out, still laughing, and Julian sat gripping the wheel, swallowing words he had never once in his life had to swallow. In his other world, a single raised eyebrow from him rearranged people's entire day. Here, he was furniture with a fare meter. By evening, his back ached, his hands were raw, and his throat was dry from calling for passengers. He parked at the curb and watched the city move around him as if he were a piece of the sidewalk. And he understood something he had been too rich to ever learn. Poor people did not only struggle because money ran short. They struggled because so many others had decided, without knowing them, that they had no value at all. That thought sat on him like a weight. He could have gone home that night, run a hot bath, put on clean clothes, and forgotten the whole foolish plan. He had earned that escape 100 times over, but he did not take it. I have to finish this, he said to no one. What he did not know was that the woman who would answer his question was already only a few streets away. But before he reached her, life had 2 hard lessons to teach him first. Her name was Destiny, and she found him on his 4th day. She slid into the back of his cab like she was doing him a favor, looked him over, and told him he was far too handsome to be driving something so ugly. She laughed easily. She touched his shoulder when she talked. She said poor men were the only ones who truly knew how to value a woman. And after 4 days of being treated like furniture, Julian let himself believe her. For a week she called him often. Come carry me here. Wait for me while I shop. Take me to my friend's place. And in between, the small requests began. So gently, he almost did not notice them tightening. Just a little for airtime, she said, and he sent it. Just a little for food, since she had not eaten all day, and he sent that too, and watched to see what she would do. The next day the number grew. Her hair was old and embarrassing her, and fixing it cost more than he made in 3 days behind the wheel. Isn't that a lot? He asked carefully. Are you calling me expensive? She shot back, wounded, and somehow he was the one apologizing. The more he gave, the more she asked, as if his giving were a door and she meant to walk through it carrying everything she could hold. And then came the day her landlord was suddenly embarrassing her, and the rent she owed all at once was more money than Jay the cab driver could see in a year. I don't have that kind of money, he told her, and watched her face change the way a sky changes before a storm. The warmth drained out of her eyes, and something calculating took its place. "Let's be serious," she said. "How can a man be this broke? You are handsome, fine. But handsome doesn't pay rent. I can't suffer with a man still dragging coins out of passengers. Stop calling me if you can't help me." When she climbed out, she did not even pay her fare. Julian sat there and finally understood. Destiny had never seen him at all. She had only seen a wallet she was still trying to open. If you have ever wondered who would really stay if the money disappeared tomorrow, then you already understand why Julian could not stop now. Subscribe to True Worth Films and stay with this story, because the answer is coming. And it is not the one he expected. The second lesson wore a gentler face. Simone climbed into his cab a few days later and did something no one had done in weeks. She noticed him. She asked if he had eaten. She told him he worked too hard. She pressed a little money into his hand and said, "Buy yourself something, please." For a man who had been invisible, that small kindness landed like sunlight. Over the next week, she called sometimes, spoke softly, asked about his day, and Julian began to think that maybe he had judged the whole world too quickly. "You are a good man, Jay," she told him once, and he almost let himself hope. Then, one Saturday evening, he was walking back from buying a part for the cab when he saw her. Simone stood leaning into the window of a clean, expensive car, laughing at something the man inside said. And when the man handed her a thick fold of cash, she took it like she had taken it many times before. Julian stopped. She saw him. Something crossed her face, and it was not shame. "What are you doing here?" she said, stepping toward him quickly, her voice low and sharp. The man in the car called out, asking who he was. And Simone, without a breath of hesitation, said, "Nobody. Just a cab driver who carries me sometimes. Nobody." The word went into him like a blade. "You said you liked me?" he said quietly. She laughed, and it was an ugly laugh. "Jay, please. Did you really think I'd leave a man with money for you? Look at your shoes. Look at that cab. You poor men always think a little kindness means love. I pitied you. Now know your level." The car door shut. The engine pulled away, and Julian stood alone at the curb, watching until the taillights disappeared into the traffic. That night, he leaned his forehead against the cab's cracked handle and let the truth settle over him. The women who had loved Julian Whitmore wanted his fortune. The women who met Jay the cab driver wanted to climb away from him as fast as they could. Rich or poor, it was the same lesson wearing two faces. Maybe, he thought, real love simply did not exist anymore, and he had wasted his whole life waiting for something the world had stopped making. He was tired in a way that sleep could not touch. He had not eaten since morning, and into that exact moment, a woman knocked on the window of his cab. "Cab, are you free?" Her name was Grace. She climbed in carefully, balancing a stack of covered containers on her lap, and the smell of home cooking filled the small space. "Please drive slow," she said. "There's soup in here, and I can't lose today's money." Julian pulled into the road gently. Before they had gone 2 blocks, another passenger tried to flag him, an impatient man who, when Julian slowed, began cursing him for driving like an old woman, telling him to park if he couldn't move. Julian said nothing, the way he had learned to say nothing. But then a voice came from behind him. "Leave him alone." It was Grace. "The road is bad. If he rushes, the cab brakes, and then nobody gets anywhere. He's being careful. Everybody out here is just trying to survive." The man muttered and looked away. And something in Julian's chest, something that had been clenched for weeks, quietly came loose. No one had defended him since he put on these clothes. No one. When they reached her stop, he tried to wave off the fare. She had stood up for him after all. But she pressed the money firmly into his palm and folded his fingers over it. "That has nothing to do with this," she said. "You worked. You get paid. God bless your hustle." Then she gathered her containers and walked away down a narrow path. And Julian sat there, holding the money and her words, like they were worth far more than either. God bless your hustle. He heard it for the rest of that night. He could not forget her. He remembered how she sat without a shred of pride, how she defended a stranger, how she refused to cheat him even out of a small fare. Days later, he saw her again, standing by the road with her containers, and he stopped without thinking. "You remembered my name," she said, surprised. "You remembered mine," he answered. She sold food, she told him. She cooked and sold plates to take care of herself and her daughter, a 6-year-old named Naya, and lately she had been carrying a heavier weight than usual. Work was thin, the rent kept rising, but she did not complain the way the others had complained. She said, "Life has seasons. Today is hard, but tomorrow can be different. We keep going." She said it like she truly believed it. And Julian, who owned 2 towers and could not believe in anything, found that he envied her. Over the following weeks, Jay, the cab driver, kept finding reasons to be near Grace Bennett. He carried her home in the evenings after she finished selling. He helped lift her heavy containers into the cab. When the rain came, he waited for her at her corner instead of chasing more fares. And when she found him there, soaked and stubborn, refusing to let her walk, she looked at him for a long moment and then, very softly, said thank you. They began to talk the way people talk when the work is hard and the day is long, about small and honest things. Fuel prices, the potholes that were slowly killing the cab. A customer who had told him his engine sounded like a dying lawnmower, which made Grace laugh so hard she nearly dropped a container. He learned her story in pieces, never all at once. Nia's father had left before the girl could walk, disappeared into another city and another life, and never sent so much as a birthday call. "People show you who they are," Grace said once, without bitterness, wiping down a counter that wasn't hers. "The trick is believing them the first time." She had built everything since then with her own 2 hands, one plate at a time, and she had made herself a small, fierce world where she owed nobody anything. He met Nia, a bright, watchful little girl who studied him with the seriousness of someone twice her age. She did not warm to strangers easily, but one afternoon she handed him a folded piece of paper, and on it, in crayon, she had drawn a yellow cab and a stick man standing beside it, taller than the cab, smiling. "That's my driver," she announced, as if it were a fact everyone already knew. Julian, who had been given cars and watches and things worth more than most people's houses, held that crayon drawing like it was the first real gift anyone had ever handed him, and slid it carefully into his shirt pocket, over his heart where it stayed. He saw the weight she carried too, even when she tried to hide it. There were evenings she counted her earnings twice, her lips moving, her face tightening at a number that would not grow, no matter how many times she added it. There was a morning he found a folded notice taped to the door of Miss Ruby's diner, and Grace pulled it down fast and stuffed it into her apron before he could read it, and forced a smile. "Landlord things," she said. "Everybody's got a landlord." He did not push. He had no idea then how much he should have. But he noticed how she never once asked him for anything, not a dollar, not a favor, not a promise. In a life where every woman he had ever met treated him like a door to walk through, Grace treated him like a person to stand beside. And slowly, without deciding to, Julian Whitmore fell in love with a woman who did not know his name was worth a fortune and would not have cared if she had. One afternoon, he saw exactly what she was made of. He had carried her to a wealthy neighborhood where she was delivering an order of home-cooked plates, and the woman who had ordered them came out, looked at the containers, wrinkled her nose, and announced that the food was not what she expected, and that she would not be paying. It was a lie, plain and cheap, the kind of lie people tell only to those they believe cannot fight back. Julian felt his old self rise up in him, ready to make a call, to crush this woman flat. But Grace did not need him. She simply gathered her containers back up, calm and unhurried, and said, "That's all right. I don't sell to people who need to steal from a working woman to feel big. Have a blessed day." And she walked back to the cab, with her head high, and Julian sat there stunned, because he had spent his whole life around people with everything who felt like nothing. And here was a woman with almost nothing, who could not be made to feel small by anyone. "Doesn't that make you angry?" he asked as they drove off. Grace shrugged. "Angry doesn't pay rent. And besides," she said, glancing at him with the ghost of a smile, "a person's today is not there forever." He looked at her for a long moment and thought, not for the first time, that she was the richest person he had ever met. He began to test her, the way he had tested the others. But with Grace, it felt shameful, even as he did it. He told her, one evening, that the cab was not his, that the owner was pressing him for money, that he might lose everything. He waited for the pity, or the exit, or the sudden coolness. Instead, she went quiet, and then she reached into her own thin envelope of the day's earnings and pushed some toward him. "It's not much," she said. "But nobody should carry a hard day alone." He did not take it. He could not. He only looked at her, this woman with almost nothing, offering it anyway. And he understood that he had finally met the thing he had stopped believing in. The double life, though, was harder to hold than he had expected. One afternoon, a man climbed into his cab in a hurry, spoke on the phone the entire ride, and then, paying the fare, looked at Julian a moment too long. "Do I know you?" the man said, frowning. "You look like somebody." Julian's heart went sideways. He kept his face flat, mumbled that he had one of those faces, and pulled away before the man could finish the thought. He sat shaking at the next corner. He had built his whole test on being no one, and he was starting to understand that being no one was not a costume he could take off cleanly. Somewhere out there, the two halves of his life were drifting toward each other, and he did not yet see how badly the collision would hurt the one person he was trying to protect. It was around this time that Julian went to check quietly on a piece of family business, the way he sometimes did to keep his footing in the world he had left behind. And that was when the ground opened beneath him. The building where Grace lived, the small block of apartments she and Naya called home, the block that held Miss Ruby's diner where Grace sold her plates, had been bought and marked for demolition. The tenants were being pushed out. The diner was being shut. And the name on every notice, the name behind the eviction, the empire swallowing the only corner of the city where Grace had built a life, was Whitmore. It was his family. It was his money. The man who had gone out into the world to find someone who would love him for nothing was, without ever knowing it, the very force grinding that someone into the dirt. If your stomach just turned at that, drop a comment with what you think Julian should do, and subscribe, because how he answers this is where the whole story turns. Julian did not sleep for 2 nights. On the 3rd day, he did something he had not done in weeks. He put on a suit, drove one of his own cars, and walked back into the Whitmore offices as Julian Whitmore, heir, and the guards who had thrown coins at cab drivers all their lives stood straighter and called him sir. He tried to stop the demolition from the inside, quietly, carefully, without letting a whisper of it reach Grace. He argued that the block was a mistake, that the numbers did not add up, that there were families living there, real people with names. His father, Harrison Whitmore, listened from behind a desk the size of a small boat, with the patience of a man watching a child throw a tantrum. "Since when," Harrison said slowly, "do you care about a row of old apartments?" "Since I found out we were tearing them down. We tear things down every week. That is the business. That is the name you were born into." His father set down his pen and studied him. "You have been strange for months, Julian. Vanishing for days, coming back smelling of the street, playing at something. Now you come in here defending tenants like a charity worker." He leaned forward. "A Whitmore does not concern himself with the people in the way. A Whitmore builds over them. That block sits exactly where the Sinclair development needs to go. And the Sinclair partnership is the most important thing this family has touched in 20 years. Nothing stands in its way. Not sentiment, not families, not you." There it was, a name Julian barely registered in that moment, sitting quietly under everything like a stone under still water. Sinclair. He would remember it later, when it was almost too late. For now, all he could do was fight for time. He called in old favors, spent goodwill he had been saving for himself, and bought exactly 30 days. It was not a rescue. It was a stay of execution. And it came with a clock now ticking over Grace's head that she could not even hear. He told himself he would tell her. He rehearsed it 100 ways in the dark. He would start with the loneliness and the foolish question that had sent him out into the street, and then he would tell her the hardest part, that his family owned her building and that he was fighting with everything he had to save it. And he would trust her, this woman who trusted so little, to understand. He owed her the truth. He knew that. He also knew that the truth might take her from him. And so he kept finding reasons to wait one more day. He planned a good day first. The way a man builds up courage. He borrowed nothing but time. And he took Grace and Nia to a quiet park on the north edge of the city, far from the diner and the notices and the weight of it all. He bought Nia an ice cream that melted faster than she could eat it. He watched Grace kick off her worn shoes and chase her daughter across the grass, laughing in a way he had never seen from her, her head tipped back, all her armor lying on the ground beside her shoes. For a few hours there was no cab and no towers and no eviction, only a man, a woman, and a little girl chasing pigeons that were far too clever to be caught. Grace sat down beside him, breathless, and for one moment let her shoulder rest against his. And Julian thought his chest might crack open from how badly he wanted to keep this. "Tell her now," he told him. "This is the moment." He turned to her. He opened his mouth, and Nia came flying across the grass and grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the swings, shrieking that he had to push her higher than the trees, and the moment folded up and slipped quietly away. Tomorrow, he told himself. He would tell her tomorrow. He should never have waited, because Grace found out on her own. It happened at the diner. A man in an expensive coat came in with paperwork about the building, and when Jay walked in behind Grace to help carry the day's containers, the man looked up and his face changed, and he half rose from his chair. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, uncertain. "I didn't expect to see you here." The whole diner went still. Grace turned. She looked at the man in the coat, and then she looked at Jay, at Julian, at whoever he was. And Julian watched the truth arrive in her eyes, in real time, piece by piece, and he could do nothing to stop it. She did not shout. That was almost the worst part. She waited until they were outside, until Nia was out of earshot with Miss Ruby. And then she turned on him with a voice like cracking ice. "Whitmore, your family owns my building. Your family's the one throwing us out. Grace, let me explain. You're rich." It was not a question. "You've been rich this whole time. The broke cab driver who couldn't pay for his cab. The man I offered my last few dollars to." Her voice shook now. Was I an experiment? Is that what this was? Some bored rich man wanted to see how the poor people would treat him? Did you have a good time, Julian? Did we perform well? It wasn't like that. I swear to you it wasn't. "You let me feed you," she said. And the tears came now, furious and hurt. "You let me defend you. You let my daughter draw you a picture. And the whole time you were the reason we're losing our home." She stepped back from him like he was something dangerous. "Stay away from us, both of us." She took Nia's hand and walked into the falling evening, and she did not look back. And Julian stood in front of the diner that his family was about to demolish and understood that he had finally been loved for who he was and had destroyed it with who he was. If you have ever been misjudged for the worst thing you ever did instead of the best thing you ever meant, then you know exactly what he was feeling. Subscribe to True Worth Films and stay with him, because a man is about to find out what he is really made of. He went to his father. He did not know where else a drowning man was supposed to swim. He walked into the great house where he had grown up, past the portraits and the silence, and he told Harrison plainly that he was in love, that her name was Grace Bennett, that she sold food from covered containers and raised a daughter alone and had loved him when she believed he had nothing to give, that he intended to marry her and to stop the demolition and to make right what the family had done to her block. His mother, Diane, sat in the corner with her hands folded, saying nothing, though her eyes softened at the word love in a way his father's never would. He expected an argument. He did not expect the trap. Harrison set down his glass and smiled, and it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who has already counted the cards. "You've had your adventure," his father said. "You went and lived like the little people, and now you've seen it. And now you're ready to come home. Your office is waiting. Your name is waiting. Every door that closed when you disappeared can open again tomorrow morning. Everything can be exactly as it was." Julian felt, against all his own sense, a flicker of relief. And then his father continued, in the same easy voice, "On one condition. You will marry Vanessa Sinclair." The name landed like a stone. Vanessa Sinclair, proud and glittering, daughter of Grant Sinclair, his father's closest business partner. Julian had known her for years and had never once liked what lived behind her eyes. "I won't marry Vanessa," he said. "I don't love her." His father's face hardened. "Love." He said the word like it was something small and childish. "Do you know what love built this family? Nothing. Alliances built it. Names built it. The Sinclair merger secures everything I have spent 40 years protecting. You will marry that girl and you will save this family. Or you will go back to your little cab and your little food cellar and see how long love feeds you. Then I'll go back," Julian said. And his father, for the first time in Julian's life, looked at him with something close to hatred and said, "Then you are no longer my son. Not my heir. Not a Whitmore. Nothing." The word he had been running from his whole life. Nothing. His father handed it to him like a sentence. Julian walked out of the only home he had ever known with what he could carry in 2 hands and the old yellow cab, which, it turned out, was the one thing in his whole life that had always truly been his. His father did not stop him. His mother watched from the window until the gate closed. Here is a question worth sitting with. If someone told you that keeping everything you owned meant marrying a person you did not love and abandoning the one you did, what would you choose? Tell me in the comments, honestly. And subscribe to True Worth Films, because most people are sure of their answer until the day they are actually asked. And across the city, the 30-day stay he had bought quietly ran out. The eviction moved forward. Grace and Nia lost their apartment. Miss Ruby's diner served its last plate to an empty street. The chairs stacked, the lights switched off for good. Grace took whatever work she could find, cooking out of a borrowed kitchen, sleeping on a friend's floor with Nia curled against her, too proud to beg and too tired to cry anywhere her daughter might see. She did not know that the man who had broken her heart had just lost his entire world trying to protect her. She only knew that everything was gone. And then, on the worst possible week, in the kind of cold that arrives only after everything else has already gone wrong, Nia got sick, a fever that climbed and would not break, a cough that rattled in her small chest, a clinic that looked at Grace's empty hands and asked for money she did not have and could not find, a little girl growing quieter and hotter and heavier in her mother's arms, hour by hour, while the clock ran and Grace, for the first time in her life, did not know how she was going to keep her child safe. If this story is hitting you where it lived, stay with it, because what happens next is the reason this story exists. Julian heard through Miss Ruby where they were. And in that moment, everything he had lost, the name, the towers, the inheritance, felt like nothing at all next to a little girl burning up on a friend's floor. He did not send money through an assistant, the way the old Julian would have, keeping his hands clean and his distance safe. He came himself, in the middle of the night, in the old yellow cab, and he ran up the stairs and carried Nia down in his own arms, and he drove them through the empty streets to a hospital, and he stayed. He did not flash a name or a card, though it would have opened every door in the building. He simply planted himself at the desk and refused to leave until a doctor saw her, and then he sat in that hard plastic waiting room chair while Grace paced and prayed and could not look at him. He bought her a coffee she did not drink. He said almost nothing, because there was nothing he could say that he had any right to say. And when the fever finally broke near dawn, when a tired nurse came out and told them the little girl would be fine, that they had come just in time, Julian was still there. Grace looked at him across that grim little room. This man she had every reason in the world to hate, red-eyed and rumpled and gray with exhaustion. And she saw that he was holding something in his hand, turning it over and over like a prayer. It was Naya's crayon drawing. The yellow cab and the smiling stick man. He had carried it in his pocket, over his heart, through everything, even after she had thrown him out of their lives. Something in the stone wall Grace had built around herself shifted, just slightly, just enough. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice breaking on the word. "Because there was nowhere else on this earth I could be," he said. It was not forgiveness, but it was not the door closing either. He did not ask her to take him back. Instead, he told her the whole truth, all of it. The loneliness and the foolish plan and the question that had started everything. And then he told her what he had decided. He was going to stop the Sinclair merger, not to win her, but because he had finally learned to look at what his family actually was. And Grace, who cooked in rich people's kitchens and cleaned up after their parties and had made herself invisible to survive, went very still. "The Sinclair," she said slowly. "I've served at their event. I've stood in the corner of their rooms while they talked like the help had no ear." She looked at him. "Julian, they're not merging with your family. They're planning to swallow it. I've heard them. When the deal is signed, they take everything, and your father ends up with his name on nothing." The thing his father had chosen over his own son was a knife pointed at his own heart. And the only person who had seen the blade was the woman Harrison had called worthless. There was one night to stop it. The merger was to be finalized at a Sinclair gala, the papers signed in front of a room full of the city's most important people. The kind of room that had cheered Julian when he had money and thrown coins at him when he didn't. He could not walk in as a Whitmore anymore. His father had erased that name from him. He had no title, no invitation, no army of lawyers. He had a woman, a cab, and the truth. And against the Sinclair machine that felt like almost nothing at all. But Grace could walk in. That was the thing the powerful never understood about the people they made invisible. She had been hired to work the gala, in the kitchen, in the plain black and white uniform that turned a person into a piece of the wallpaper. For years, she had stood in the corners of rooms exactly like this one, refilling glasses for people who talked about their schemes as freely as if the help had no ears, no memory, no worth. She knew things. She had heard Grant Sinclair on a balcony months ago, before she had ever met a cab driver named Jay, laughing about the old man who thought he was gaining a partner. And now she understood what she had been carrying all along. So the plan took shape between them across a hospital chair and a borrowed kitchen table. Not a rich man sweeping in to rescue a poor woman. Two people the world had thrown away, deciding together to walk into the lion's mouth, each carrying the half of the truth the other could not reach. The gala glittered the way those rooms always glitter, with light bouncing off glass and gold and teeth. Harrison Whitmore stood near the front, proud and certain, a man who believed he was about to secure his legacy for another generation. Grant Sinclair stood beside him, with a gold fountain pen and a smile that never went past his lips. Vanessa Sinclair floated through the crowd in a dress that cost more than the building Grace had lost, accepting congratulations on an engagement to a groom who was not coming. And a string quartet played, and waiters moved through the room like ghosts, and one of them was watching everything. Then, just as the two men lifted their pens, the doors at the back of the room opened, and Julian Whitmore walked in wearing the cab driver's clothes, the grease-stained shirt, the worn shoes, the clothes of a man who had nothing. The music faltered. Heads turned. A ripple of confused, contemptuous murmuring moved through the crowd, the same sound they made at a beggar who had wandered somewhere he did not belong. His father's face drained of all its color and then flooded with fury. "Get him out," Harrison said tightly. "Now." But Julian did not walk toward his father. He walked toward the truth. "Before you sign that," he said, and his voice carried, steady and clear, across the whole silenced room. "You should know what you're signing." And in front of every important person in the city, he laid it out. The shell companies hidden 3 layers deep, the debt buried inside the partnership like a landmine, the single quiet clause that handed the entire Whitmore empire to the Sinclairs the very moment the ink dried. Not a murder, a slow, elegant execution, dressed up as a gift. For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Grant Sinclair laughed, a rich, easy, practiced laugh, and spread his hands to the room. "And there it is," he said. "The disowned son, cut off, penniless, out of his mind with jealousy, crashing a party in rags to slander the man his own father chose over him. Somebody call security before this gets sad." A few nervous chuckles moved through the crowd. Harrison's jaw tightened, caught between his son's warning and his partner's scorn. And Julian saw the doubt cross his father's face, saw him begin to choose the comfortable lie. And that was when a waiter set down her tray. Grace stepped out from the wall, where she had been invisible all evening, still in her plain uniform, and walked to the center of the room, and set down on the signing table a folder and a small recorder. She pressed a button, and Grant Sinclair's own voice filled the ballroom, unhurried and cruel, describing exactly how he would gut the old man's company and leave him with his name on nothing. The color that had drained from Harrison's face now drained from Grace. Grace opened the folder beside it. The documents, the dates, all of it gathered from the corners of rooms where a powerful man had never once bothered to notice the woman filling his glass. "You talked like we couldn't hear you," Grace said quietly. To Grant, to the whole glittering room. "People like you always do." The recording played on, and the truth that a billionaire's warning could not make them believe was made undeniable by an invisible woman in a kitchen uniform. The room turned all at once, the way a flock of birds turn. The important people who had come to bless the Sinclairs suddenly, urgently, remembered other places they needed to be. Business partners peeled away. Photographers who had come to capture a triumph now captured a collapse. Grant Sinclair's smile finally cracked all the way through, and Vanessa's practiced poise shattered with it. And the two of them found themselves standing in the wreckage of the trap they had built, exposed in front of everyone who mattered. And Harrison Whitmore stood in the ruin of the deal he had chosen over his own son, and watched every powerful friend he had spent 40 years cultivating drift toward the exits without meeting his eye, and slowly understood that he was standing almost alone. Almost. Because 2 people in that entire glittering room had not moved an inch. His disowned son in a cab driver's shirt, and a food seller in a kitchen uniform. The woman he had called unworthy of his name. The only 2 people left standing beside him were the 2 he had thrown away. Harrison looked at the 2 of them for a long time in the empty, ruined ballroom, the crystal still glittering over the wreckage of everything he had won. And then, slowly, he reached into his coat and took out an old, worn wrist watch, the cheap steel kind, scratched and dull, its band cracked with age, and he turned it over in his hand, like it hurt to hold. "This was my father's," he said, and his voice was no longer the voice of an emperor. It was just the voice of a tired old man. He drove a delivery truck, 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, so I could have the things he never had. And I spent my whole life making sure no one would ever find out that the great Harrison Whitmore came from a man in work boots who smelled of diesel. He looked at the watch. "I kept this in a drawer, hid, ashamed of the best man I ever knew." Then he lifted his eyes to Grace, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the roadside, but the person. "I called you unworthy of my family," he said. "I looked at a woman who works with her hands, raises a child alone, and treats strangers with more decency than anyone in this room ever showed me. And I decided she was beneath it. I was wrong. God forgive me. I was so wrong." His voice broke. I asked my son who was worthy of the Whitmore name. I had the question upside down my entire life. It was never who is good enough for us. It was whether we were ever good enough for them. He closed his hand around his father's watch and slipped it onto his own wrist, where he would wear it, openly, from that day until his last. The people who were still standing here when I had nothing left. He said quietly, looking at his son and the food cellar he had scorned. That is the only answer that was ever true. That is what worth means. I just had to lose everything to learn. Julian crossed the room and did something he had not done since he was a boy. He put his arms around his father. And Harrison Whitmore, who had built an empire on never showing weakness, held on to his son, and the Sinclair's scheme collapsed under the weight of what Grace had carried in. The empire, exposed in time, survived, though it would never again be the cold and gleaming thing it had been. And Harrison, humbled in a way no amount of money could have, began the slow work of becoming a father instead of a patron. But the story did not end with the empire saved, because the empire was never the point. It ended slowly in the weeks that came after, and it did not end easily. Julian went to find Grace, and he did not go the way the old Julian would have gone, with a check and a car and a fortune spread out like an apology. He went with his hands open and empty, in the only way that it ever meant. He found her in the borrowed kitchen, an apron on, flour on her hands, and she did not soften when she saw him. "I don't want to give you things," he said. "Every woman I have ever known wanted the thing. That was the whole reason I put on those clothes in the first place, to find someone who... And then I found you, and I lied to you, and I understand if that's the end. But I'm not asking for a fortune to fix it. I'm asking to earn a place. Slowly, with work, the way you earn everything." Grace looked at him for a long, long moment, and then she looked down at Nia, who had crept out from behind her legs and was staring up at the man who had sat in a plastic hospital chair until her fever broke and never once left. "You lied to me," Grace said. "I did," Julian answered, "and I will spend as long as it takes making sure I never do it again." She did not fall into his arms. Grace Bennett was not that kind of woman, and Julian did not want her to be. She made him show up, week after week, in the old yellow cab, doing the plain and unglamorous work of proving. He carried her container. He fixed the leaking pipe in the borrowed kitchen with his own hand. He came to Naya's little school play and clapped louder than anyone in the room. He did not buy his way back into her life, because he finally understood that the things you buy are the first things people stop believing. And only when she was ready, on her own terms and in her own time, with no fortune involved, did Grace let him back in. Not because he was rich again, because he had become, at last, a man worth trusting. They did not rebuild her old life. They built a new one, and they built it for other people too. With the family fortune finally turned towards something other than time, Julian and Grace opened a foundation, and its very first work was the block that had been torn down. But it did not stop there. They helped cab drivers own the cars they drove, through fair terms, instead of the crushing debt that had kept men like Jay chained to a daily return they could never quite pay off. One of the first was a driver who wept when he was handed the keys to a car that was finally actually his. "I have driven other men's cars for 11 years, he said. "Nobody ever thought I could own one." Grace held his hand and told him what a stranger had once told her by the roadside. "God bless your heart." They set up single mothers with kitchens and small business cabs, so that a woman like Grace would never again have to choose between the rent and her child's medicine, never again have to carry a burning daughter to a clinic and be turned away for empty hands. Miss Ruby's diner was rebuilt on the same corner, and she ran it herself, prouder than she had ever been. And the very plates that Grace had once sold from covered containers by the roadside now filled a warm room with people who called her by her name. And inside the Whitmore Company itself, a new rule took hold. one that Julian and his changed father wrote together and hung where everyone could read. No one in this house is treated as small. Not the driver, not the cleaner, not this young woman carrying trays through the back door. Every single person here is some of the old executives were startled by it. Harrison Whitmore, wearing his father's scratched steel watch openly now, told them he had spent his whole life ashamed of a man in work boots, and that he intended to spend whatever years he had left making up for it. One evening, months into the slow and patient work of earning her back, Julian came to Grace with a small box. It was not a grand box. There was no crowd, no photographer, no orchestra. They were sitting on the steps of the rebuilt diner after closing, Nia asleep against her mother's shoulder. He opened it, and Grace looked at the ring inside, and then at him, and she did not say yes right away. "You have to promise me some things first," she said. "You will always stand with me. You will never let anybody make me feel small again. And you will never forget where we started." "How could I forget the old cab?" he said. And she smiled. And only then, on her own terms, in her own time, did Grace Bennett say yes. They married on a bright, ordinary afternoon, and it was nothing like the weddings the Whitmore name had thrown before. There was no crowd assembled to be impressed. It was simple, and it was and Grace wore something she chose because she loved it, not because it cost enough to make. Nia carried the rings and refused to let go of Julian's hand the entire ceremony. Harrison sat in the front row with his father's old watch on his wrist, wearing it openly now. And when he looked at his, there were tears he did not bother to hide. And parked just outside, washed but still faithfully dented, its paint still dull and its horn still weak, sat the old yellow cab. Some of the faces in that small crowd belonged to people who had once laughed at a cab driver in the street, who had thrown coins at his, who had decided in a glance that he and the woman beside him were not. They watched now with something quieter in their eyes. Some of them small, some of them you could wished they had been kinder when kindness cost them. But Grace did not need their approval anymore, and she never had. She had something better than the respect of people who only respect a fortune. She had peace. After Julian pulled Grace aside for a quiet moment, away from the noise. She saw the cab and laughed. "You kept this?" "Of course I kept it." He said. "How could I throw it away? It suffered with me. It led me to you." She ran her hand along the cracked, remembering the night she had climbed in with her containers and told a broke, exhausted stranger that God should bless his. "You remembered that," she said softly. "I remember," he answered. "That old cab gave me the best thing I have ever had." "And what's that?" He looked at her, and at Nia spinning in her dress on the grass, and at his father laughing with Miss Ruby by the door. "A place," he said. "A place where the money was switched off and somebody stayed in." Julian Whitmore had gone out into the world pretending to be poor, because he wanted to test whether love was real. But in the end, love had tested him instead. It had asked him whether he could love people who could give him nothing, whether he could stand beside the powerless when it cost him, whether he could become the kind of man his fortune had never let him be. And the man who once knelt on the pavement to gather the coins a laughing crowd had thrown at his feet, now stood tall, holding the hand of a woman who had loved him when he had nothing, in front of a father who had finally learned the same lesson the hard. True worth was never it was never the name on the. True worth is the person who stays gentle when they think you have nothing, the one who defends a stranger, who offers their last few dollars, who blesses your hustle without knowing your name. If this story reached something in you, tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe to True Worth Films so the next story finds you. Because in a world that throws coins at people it decides are nothing, the ones who kneel to help you pick them up are the only ones who were ever truly rich. And for Julian and Grace, and a little girl named Nia, love finally, quietly, found a home.